Awesome. So my name is Michaela Blanton, and I am the intern with 350 Colorado's Regenerative Ag and Local Food Committee. Super excited to be here, and I'm super excited that we have this great webinar put together for you tonight on trends and opportunities to elevate regenerative ag in Colorado. Speaking tonight will be Don Thilmany, who is a professor of agribusiness and an extension economist with Colorado State University. We'll also have Nicole Savita, who is Sustainable Food System Specialization Lead in the Masters of the Environment program, and she's also someone that I work with and has taught me and is one of my mentors, so I'm excited to have her here tonight. And then we'll also have Wendy Peters-Moschetti, who leads the development and implementation of LiveWell Colorado's strategies related to food systems, food access, and food promotion. Should be a pretty exciting talk. I'm really excited about it. I just want to remind everyone to please mute yourself if you're not speaking. There will be time for questions at the end, and you can unmute at that time. Also, I want to let everyone know that we are Facebook live streaming, and we'll also be recording this. So if you're uncomfortable with that, please turn your video off and mute yourself as well. And without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and
Michaela?
start. Yeah, what was
Michaela, sorry, this is Wendy. Hi.
Hi, Wendy.
Amazing job on getting all of our names pronounced correctly. That was like incredible.
You want to know something? I asked Nicole beforehand to make sure, so
okay,
I cheated a little.
No, that's not cheating. That's doing your homework, and it's very much appreciated. So, but also Dawn is texting me saying she is not, somehow she's blocked. She's not able to enter. So I don't think she's on the line.
Okay. I don't see her I don't see her in the waiting room, but I will send her an email with the link right now.
Yeah, if she can try to log back in, that would be great.
And I had to log back in to make it work. And I asked if she had the password. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to let you know she's, just also while I'm holding the microphone here, I apologize. I have zero power, so no Wi-Fi, so I'm on phone only. This is Wendy, so when it gets to my slides, I'm just gonna have to kind of say, next slide, please, and yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being flexible and for being willing to call in the middle of a power outage. I really appreciate that.
Of course, we're glad to be here. And sorry, it's not even letting her get so far as enter a password. Okay, I'm texting with Dawn and trying to troubleshoot, but sorry, don't want to just, I know Nicole's kicking off. Thank you.
Thank you.
And while we're waiting, I'll just jump in if that's okay, Michaela. I'm Micah Parkin. I'm Executive Director of 350 Colorado, one of the founders, and just really appreciate Michaela, who is our intern for our Regenerative Ag and Local Food Committee, and all of the members of that committee. And so if any of you are excited about regenerative agriculture or local food and want to join that committee, we want to invite you right off the bat to get involved. And you can go to 350colorado.org to sign up under Get Involved or Volunteer, and on that form it'll be one of the options of ways that you can get involved with 350 Colorado, because we realize that not only do we need to be saying no to the things that we don't want, but we also need to be saying yes to the things that we do want, and that helps to create the future that we want. And part of that, of course, is local food and regenerative agriculture that helps to sequester carbon in the soil and rebuild our soils and build more healthy plant systems and food systems and more healthy people and climate and world for that matter. So thanks again, everybody, for being part of this, and we hope you'll join our committee if you're interested.
I think, Micah, that we can probably go ahead and get started. I'm working with Dawn separately, but since Nicole's starting, if you want to share the slides. You're ready, Nicole?
Sure thing. Micah, you're going to share the slides, and then I'll just tell you to advance them as we go. Is that how we're going to do this? All right. I think I can see them now. So hello, everybody. I took a quick scroll through the participants list as everybody was joining, and I see some familiar faces, but more that are new to me, which is exciting. My name is Nicole Savita. As Michaela said, I lead the Sustainable Food Systems specialization in the Masters of the Environment program at CU Boulder. I'm trained as a food and agriculture lawyer and policy person, but I have kind of moved my career into doing more ethics work and systems work. And my role tonight is going to be primarily to set the stage and to create a vision with you of the food system that I think we want to have and we want to really gather momentum around building as we come through the COVID crisis and try to think about what we can learn from this kind of disruption. Next slide, please. So my talk really lays out 3 aspirations for the future food system that I'm centering on in this time of what I think about as both disruption and possibility. And so I'm going to sketch out a vision for food systems that are regenerative, that are resilient, and that are redemptive. Next slide. So why my title is Sustainable Food Systems. We talk about food system sustainability, but why are we now shifting a focus just from sustainability to regeneration? And Dr. Montenegro's quote, which I have on the screen here, and I'll read to make it a little more accessible to folks, I think really gets to the heart of it, right? So sustainable food, in quotes, as a concept, attempts to heal the fragile system, our fragile food system, and it's been a buzzword for 3 decades. Its mushrooming incarnations, local, organic, biodynamic, fair trade, and slow food, among others, suggest a broad yearning for something better. But modern capitalism is wondrously efficient at disciplining outliers. And so it hasn't taken much for the dynamics of competition and price to sweep countercultural ideas into the industrial mainstream, forcing enterprises in many, though not all, sustainable food niches to expand in size, to adopt monoculture techniques, and to replicate the basic model of industrial overproduction. And so this is a more nuanced way of saying a lot of what we moved to over the last several decades to try to do less harm than what we now call conventional agriculture hasn't quite succeeded because much of it has drifted towards the model that we've been trying to replace. And so rather than just trying to do less harm, we actually want to shift towards thinking about whether we can feed ourselves and do good and be net positive in the process. Next slide. So when I talk about regenerative and regeneration as a concept, I'm really talking about intentions and actions that continually enhance the vitality of a place, a person, an entity, a community, or a system. And I figured tonight that given what this group is and what probably drew you here, I wasn't going to spend a ton of my time talking about the production practices that contribute to regenerative farming specifically, but rather thinking more holistically about regenerative systems and a spectrum of regeneration. Along with a colleague of mine, Dr. Pete Newton, and several of Michaela's colleagues in the MENV program, we've actually been doing a comprehensive study of how regenerative agriculture is being defined and used, both in the academic literature and in practitioner literature, which we're nearly done with. And basically the results of that is it's being defined in many, many, many different ways, outcome-based ways, process-based ways. And there's real tension around whether or not it's time to define regenerative agriculture or whether that is something that is better to be left undefined so that it can be more adaptive and place-based. And so that's a tension right now, but I think all of it comes back to this concept of continually enhancing vitality. Next slide. Also, when we talk about regeneration, and here I'm borrowing from the work of Ethan Soloviev and Bill Reed, we kind of can think about it on a spectrum between degenerative and regenerative production, with a kind of whole gamut of conventional production, more kind of green, but maybe greenwash production, sustainable production, something we can continue doing, things that are maybe a little bit more restorative, and then things that truly become regenerative. You can also see this is overlaid with a trajectory of ecological design, where we can think about whether the design of systems is really driven by technology or is modeled on living systems, and whether the systems are more or less energy intensive. What I think is important about that when we think about climate is not that we can't use technology in living systems design, but we think about what we're modeling based on, and kind of what is leading us there. So I think you can integrate technical innovation to do a better job of living systems design, but that we're talking about really being inspired by and modeled on ecological and biological processes. Next slide. So given the press of time, I also want to kind of unpack the concept of resilience and what we mean when something is resilient. I think of it as possessing or exhibiting the capacity to preemptively prepare for sudden unpredicted disruptions, and then to recover from those disruptions and actually take advantage of the opportunities produced by them, opportunities that are new but are often disguised, produced by them to actually start thriving. So you can see that continued production and increase of vitality, and then seeing disruptions as, you know, not so, like, nobody wants to be doing their entire life via Zoom right now, but there's a disruption that's causing us to reevaluate the way we interact, the way we do our work, the way we build community. And if we are resilient, we can actually capture what Judith Rodin calls the resilience dividend. Resilience can really be exhibited and observed at a range of levels, from the individual organism, from our individual human capacities, all the way through sectors and societies. So we can think about resilient capacity on a farm. We can think about a resilient community. We can think about resilience in the entire food system. And it's really important that we're thinking about that in that kind of fractal way, where we're building resilience at each level. Next slide. When I started talking about resilience in the food system, probably about 8 years ago, nobody wanted to listen. And I would call up and do webinars for national, city, and county health organization professionals and public health folks. And I would say, we really need to focus on food system resilience because there are going to be these disruptions. And they'd think that I was only talking about climate change. And of course, I was talking about much broader set of disruptions, certainly including epidemics and pandemics. But it wasn't a winning argument several years ago, and the tables have turned a bit. But when I think about needing to be resilient, it is certainly because the climate changing is going to have a lot of increasing disruptions in store for us. But we also want to build resilience to economic shocks, to food price volatility, to conflict and displacement in various parts of the world, to things like what we're going through right now. We need to think about trends toward urbanization and urban-rural linkages. We need to think about the role of over, under, and malnutrition, and how that might make us at the individual and at the community levels more or less resilient, typically less resilient. Political polarization and how that changes the dynamics of how we conceptualize the opportunities in front of us. Widening inequality and how that makes us more resistant and rigid, fragile. And resistance in all its forms. We think about things like pesticide resistance, fungicide resistance, antibiotic resistance, but also resistance to change in how humans organize themselves and feed themselves. Next slide. So what are the characteristics of resilient food systems? I have outlined these as being diverse, distributed, natural, innovative, social, inclusive, just, and deliberate. And I'm going to go rapid fire really, really fast through what I think all of these are, and then I'm happy to have these slides made available to you later so that you can kind of ponder them a little more deeply. Next slide. So we think about diversity. We really think about food systems that are going to connect and disconnect across geographies in ways that are sensible and sensitive, not just about how do we send food to the places where it gives us the most profit. We think about wanting to get more diversity of species and genetics, both cultivated and wild, in and around our food system. We think about wanting to liberate seed stocks, to diversify who controls them, and to optimize the production of ecosystem services. And Dawn will talk a little bit about kind of our local and regional food systems and how they help to, I think, diversify these supply chains, which is really important. Next slide. Distributed. So right now we're experiencing a lot of the challenges of what a hyper-consolidated food system looks like, particularly with our meat supply and our meat supply chain. So a more resilient food system would feature multiple flows of food, produce, of inputs, workforces, opportunities to earn, and remittances. And it would really have us growing different kinds of foods in various locations across the landscape and closer in and around as part of our built environments. So I'm talking about distributing centrally and peripherally, vertically and horizontally. Next slide. Natural. So we really think about food systems being resilient when they can acknowledge and nurture synergies between climate, ecosystem, and food system needs. By modeling on natural systems, this is what I was talking about, we can better manage and utilize natural resources, we can help mitigate some food risks, and hopefully protect and preserve the quality of available resources, certainly like water being especially important here in the arid West. Next slide. Innovative. So this is a little bit of what I was signaling before. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to eschew technology entirely and be totally backward looking and kind of wistful for an imagined past. But I think that regardless of where we're talking about, we want to be innovative. We want to move towards circularity. We want to close waste cycles. We want to make the highest and best use of nutrients and make really good use of appropriate technology. But we want to do that with all of these other principles in mind as well and make sure that we're managing to hold tight to all of them. Next slide. Social. It's super important to remember that our food systems are built by and for people, and so we need to keep the reason for the food system at the heart of it. And I think the reason is nourishing humanity, right? We're not doing this just to make money for people. We're not doing this just to keep actors that have long been in business or have long been able to produce continuing to be able to do so. We have to center on this idea that we are actually trying to nourish humanity. And so we want to provide the benefits of employment opportunities with really good living wages, opportunities for advancement, rewarding, and safe work through resilient food systems. We want to think about our food systems as tools for poverty alleviation, community building, and even individual empowerment as sites for engagement. Next slide. Really important that our food systems be inclusive, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Certainly when we think about inclusion, and when we think about inclusion at this moment, when we have this kind of cresting wave of awareness about racism and movement towards anti-racism in our country, we want to think about how we are inclusive across race, gender, religion, ethnicity, all kinds of belief systems and identities, but we also want to think that be inclusive about all the actors involved, right? The various stakeholders and the various kinds of ways of making change and managing resources. So policy, market, commons, community, it's all on the table. Next slide. following on from inclusive, we want our systems to be just, right? We want to have this objective of leaving no one hungry, cut off, or disproportionately vulnerable, more vulnerable than others. So the aim is not to have any particular group of people suffer the externalized harms of agricultural production. This is an environmental justice and food justice goal. And we really kind of want to destabilize rather than reinforce those structural isms and imbalances of power that have gotten us to where we are today. Next slide. Finally, we want these to be deliberate, right? There's lots of great values to bring to our food work, but it's really difficult to make all of those values optimized in each situation. And so this does require multi-stakeholder coordination and then hard choices, sometimes really difficult moves, right? Sometimes we may have to shift what it is we're eating or who it is has the most power. We might have to change the ways in which we're using land. And we might need to do some more governance. So we need to really be making hard calls in deliberate ways, rather than just letting it all evolve by accident. Next slide. So my last principle is that I believe food systems need to be redemptive. And redemptive acts are acts that are intended to right prior wrongs, that are intended to compensate for harms or clear debts, and to make change for the better. But I think the key piece here is that we have to acknowledge that there have been lots of intense wrongs committed through and on behalf through our food system by food system actors, whether that we're individually responsible or complicit in those things. Many of us have benefited from those wrongs in direct and indirect ways, and I think we have to really look at how to begin correcting those actively. Next slide. So here I want to really give credit to the folks at Soul Fire Farm, our local Mile High farmers, and my good friends at Frontline Farming, Fatima Imad and Damian Thompson and their staff, who have started to really outline some routes to redemption in food systems. And there's some key sort of policy and practice points outlined here, right? We are still running in this country penal farms and using lots of incarcerated labor for food processing. Our 13th Amendment, when it ended slavery, carved out a really big exception for those who were convicted of a felony. And so we still have what is functionally slave labor in our food system in the United States. It's time to end that. I don't think we can be regenerative without taking on these acts of redemption as well. We need to end agricultural exceptionalism and really start pulling back on the ways in which our environmental and labor laws just simply don't apply to lots of agricultural activity or agriculture and food system employers, or don't apply evenly, and make sure we get protections for our agricultural and food system workers. We need to create pathways to legalization for the undocumented people laboring in our food system. And we need to support producers in actually being able to do these things as well. So this is not just a question of saying individual farmers need to solve these things, but rather we need to put public investment into rebalancing these systems. We ought to really take seriously the idea of supporting farm workers and eventually transitioning into land and business ownership, so that opportunities for running your own business and running it well become available. I think we need to kind of switch our model from simply trying to incentivize the provision of ecosystem service, the adoption of better practices, and actually start charging or taxing for the negative externalities that come from industrial production of food, and then taking that money and redirecting it to either supporting regenerative and resilient transition or to farmers who are protecting the public good and providing those ecosystem services. We also need to meaningfully support urban agriculture. As I said before, as we are increasingly urbanizing, we need to think about integrating food, to not kind of separate food production from food consumption and where we live. It's not that urban agriculture is going to meet all of our food needs, but I think we have to stop thinking about it as this kind of fun hobby some people do, and recognize the real potential and resilience building capacities. And we need to provide capital, credit, tax breaks, and importantly, business incubation services to worker and community-owned cooperative food enterprises, particularly those that create earnings opportunities and generate wealth for Black and Indigenous people of color. And I think last slide. So I've talked to you about what the vision is, and I think when we think about how we actually start to get there, we certainly need to be thinking with a systems mindset. We need to be not only kind of trying to fix individual components and focusing on them one at a time, but really seeing them in relationship with each other. We need to do multidisciplinary analysis. I've been on more Zoom calls with Wendy and Dawn than I could possibly count since March. And what's been wonderful about that is that we're each trained in really different ways, and we get to bring our individual expertise together. And, you know, none of us sees the whole picture. We've all got to rely on collaborating with each other to develop these full scope solutions that are eco-literate, that are justice framed, that have the possibility of redemption. We have to not be afraid of appropriate regulation. That's part of that ending the exceptionalism, but we need to also think not just about robust regulation, but scale appropriate regulation. So our regulations don't become too onerous for smaller producers. We need to start to marshal political will and build alliances, even when sometimes they might require us to find some strange bedfellows. But we also need to have a real willingness to shift and let go of some of our power. And we often talk about building or bringing more people to the table, but I think we actually have to kind of build new tables, right? We have to co-create them. We have to recognize that just inviting someone to the table doesn't necessarily mean that we are valuing their contributions there, or that it is, you know, built in the right size and shape for them. So we need to be thinking about really recreating our spaces in different ways. And so I just want to end with the quote from brilliant systems thinker Donella Meadows, who says, "Systems thinking can lead us to the edge of what analysis can do, and then point beyond to what can and must be done by the human spirit." And that's the work that I hope that you'll all join us in doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was wonderful. Dawn, it seems like you were able to get on the call, right?
I am here now.
Hi, Dawn. Thank you so much. I'm glad that we were able to get you on. I think we can just go ahead and go right on if everyone's ready.
Yeah, thank you for your patience while I did get online.
Oh,
so
thank you for yours.
So if you want to put the slides back up, again, I'm Dawn Thilmany. I'm at Colorado State University. I've been here since about 1997. And I'm both in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics as a professor, but because we're a land grant, I also have played a role in our extension system for about 20 years and helped us create our food systems team up here, which includes a lot of us on campus, but because of extension, we also have county agents in all of our counties here in Colorado, and I'd say about a third of those counties are represented on our team as well. So we have a set of people out throughout the state that work on these issues. You'll see a stark transition. We're moving from an eloquent speaker to an economist, where the slides will be far less pretty and the words will be less eloquent, but I'll have numbers and charts. So forgive me for that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the programming we do at both the state and national level that has been fixing some of those problems, again, kind of more in a siloed way, as we've seen them evolve over the last 2 decades, but all with the intention of having it integrate us into the discussions, these great interdisciplinary discussions about how we start putting the puzzle pieces back together. So next slide. You know, just to put some numbers to it, the reason we know that direct and local markets are something at top of mind with an increasing set of Americans is because we've continued to see sales in this space expand greatly. It's still just a a small tip of the iceberg in terms of the full food system, but it's growing quickly enough that we know it shows one of the most interesting dynamics. And what's also interesting to note is that it's moved beyond farmers markets and CSAs and roadside stands, although a lot of people still love those, to having new innovations like were brought up before, where we have food hubs throughout the country who are also trying to make it easier for us to get those into schools and hospitals and stores. So we think almost 200,000 people now participating in some way as farmers and ranchers wanting to get into these alternative markets out of 2 million total. But more importantly, it's some of those producers that really we are looking to help give a hand because they may have been historically disadvantaged, and I'll return back to that. Next slide. The other thing we've really noticed is, besides the marketplace, just a really strong interest in bringing a new policy dimension to our discussions about where food fits into our society. So this is something one of our students put together, showing just that remarkable growth in both the US, their tribal nations, and Canada in number of food policy councils over the last decade or so. And so we know both in the marketplace and in the policy arena, this is just a very dynamic space. And quite honestly, some of us in the academic and research world have tried hard to keep up with it, because compared to some of the more traditional issues we worked on, it's just, quite a bit more dynamic. And so it's almost us at the same time we're trying to learn and teach, simultaneously learning back from all of you we have discussions with. Next slide. And that does include Colorado, who has a Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council that Nicola and Wendy and I sit on together, but also even within Colorado, besides the state level one, we have several regional ones that LiveWell has helped to support as well. So when we talk about local foods, those of us as researchers, and this kind of complements what Nicole just talked about, know that people mean different things when they talk about they want to support local foods. So for some people, they want to support small, mid-sized, and diverse farmers. For others, that means they really want to support their community's economy. For others, they think there's a public health dimension, and that's why LiveWell's been very active. And for others, it's environmental impacts. And again, Nicole covered all those, but why it's important for us as researchers and extension programs to break those apart is they almost become different target audiences to do our education, technical assistance, and research for. And so I'll try to give some evidence of work we do in each of these spaces just quickly today, but no, I have, from me and my colleagues' work, a lot more we could share. I just wanted to hit highlights, and if you want to reach out, I can give you more details than anything I'm just touching on tonight. Next slide. So for instance, as I said, we know consumers are interested. A report that the USDA put out, which summarized a bunch of studies done across the country, including a couple we did here in Colorado, just shows that it's not just about the number of dollars being spent, but the fact that we're able to secure premiums for some of these producers. Because as someone has already said in the chat box, when we change to these new models of agriculture that have a fairer return to farmers, or perhaps because they are trying to have less negative externalities, they encompass more of those costs themselves in their business. We know we have to offer farmers a premium for them to be sustainable and viable. So the very first work I did was in the consumer space, just again to get to the heart of, is this a viable market opportunity we can share with our producers? Next slide. And it's also stemming from the fact that in a traditional, conventional system, the amount we know of a food dollar spent by a consumer or household, a very small share of it was getting it back to the farmer, because it was switching hands so many times. And if you have 5 different links in that supply chain, each one of those links wants to make a little money off of that product. Whereas if you go to these direct markets that we often find producers working in, we know they retain a much higher, they're not only getting perhaps a better price, they're also retaining a higher share of that food dollar. 2 great stories there. Then if they are absorbing some of those externalities that other operations have, it gives them a little more money to do their business in a way that allows them to be regenerative, but also more of that dollar staying in the community that farm operates in and having a broader economic development aspect to it as well. Next slide. And again, this is all meant to be addressing some of the problem that I think has been alluded to in the fact that those red bars are just like the red traffic lights. Those are farmers in our country that are in the danger zone. I wish I had more current numbers, but sadly they definitely would not be better today and perhaps might be worse. And so all of our farmers are in a bit of a danger zone, and we've heard about that in the news, but particularly those farmers to the left-hand side who are smaller or mid-sized farms, and you may have some other socially disadvantaged aspects to them. We were looking for models that we could offer them opportunities to it be less likely that they were operating in that profit zone area that's a red light and was not going to allow them to be sustainable in the long run. Next slide. So something we've been working on with a set of colleagues, quite honestly, not just in Colorado, but across the country, is the tension there, because it's great when we have a higher share of that farm dollar, food dollar, like up above, going to the farm in those direct markets, but it's very hard for the farmer to get the volume they need to sell in those markets. Whereas down below, where we have those commodity markets that allow us to sell hundreds and thousands of units at a time, not enough of that dollar staying with the farm. So we really try to help farmers explore how to get the right balance there of getting enough sales and enough volume and a business model that allows them to make the money they need to keep their farm viable, but to keep a high enough share of the dollar at their farm level that they can be here 10 and 20 years from now, even with some of these more innovative production models that you all are trying to support with your activities. Next slide. No need to look at all the numbers, and that's why I draw a box around it. The reason we feel compelled to keep doing this work is when we looked between two of our last censuses at farmers who were there in 2007 and were still there in 2012, and we still need to do this analysis because we have the 2017 numbers now. We know that farms that are in direct markets and are small size are more likely to be surviving if they're operating in these markets. So we have good evidence that we're helping the survival of these farms, and particularly as you see on the right-hand side, if they're beginning farmers or socially disadvantaged farmers, it's even more important that they be operating in this space if they want to be financially viable and still in business in the future. Next slide. And again, all these come from longer reports where I gave you links in the slides so you can go explore them yourself, but happy to share them with you too if you reach out. And finally, we did start developing a set of fact sheets because we really feel like US policymakers need to understand how different the business models are for these types of farmers, and that the policies that were great and supportive for the ag sector of 1950 are no longer appropriate and targeted right to be supportive of the farm business models that have become more innovative and, quite honestly, more consumer responsive in this day and age. And so we're trying to work directly with academics and with nonprofits, but also even the farm credit agencies for them to understand how to even be fair in giving capital resources to these farm businesses. We have a series of fact sheets you can go look at. Next slide. Another program we have here in Colorado Building Farmers, is specifically to address this. How do we start bringing farmers who weren't born into farm families or weren't traditionally there and don't want to follow traditional business models that have been more historically taught by our land grant into the system in a way that's best suited both to their markets, to the vision they have of what kind of farm they want to be, and to align with some of the more progressive consumers who are shopping and looking for farmers to connect with that are producing and selling products in a way that's aligned with their value system. Next slide. Another program we're very active in looking at is bringing farms to schools. And this has been one of the most active policy spaces in US agriculture, quite honestly. You can see how many schools are participating, the dollars of sales we see going through those, but we really knew there really hadn't been the type of evaluation that, again, sometimes policymakers want to justify and sustain those programs. So we've been doing a project with the Farm to School Network to look at exactly these things. And again, I'll give you some highlights of what we found. Next slide. The tagline of that organization is "Kids win, farmers win, communities win." For most of our work, we're focusing right now on Farmers Win, although I'll give you insights on a couple of the other potential wins. Next slide. Sorry, I'm booking through these, just trying to make sure I leave time for Wendy. So in the Kids Win category, and I wish I could take credit for this, but this is work that my colleagues did working with our Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition. And they did a great scan of all the literature that's been done, and they found that there's really consistent evidence that this farm to school programming has made a linkage with, you know, eater behavior, and that we're seeing students really having a healthier and positive relationship with their food selection choices because of what's being offered in their schools. Unfortunately, there hasn't been as conclusive evidence on whether it's really changed fruit and vegetable consumption and preferences by those school kids. But the one thing we could look at, and I don't want to get into the weeds here, but we have found that in households and communities where the farm to school programming is very active, and that's at the county level, we do see households on average eating 1 to 2 servings more fruit and vegetables a week as self-reported than we do in areas that don't have active farm to school programming. And we're still working on getting that refined enough to get that published. Next slide. But I think that's great news. So then us geeky economists have to go and put numbers to it. So what we're trying to look at now is, what does it mean for the farmer's bottom line? Just like we looked at before about how direct markets might be helping survivability, we want to look at what it might mean for profitability. So we're taking a very traditional look at farm profitability, but what we decided to do is add some layers around that. And that was looking at both how the farm to school intensity in a county might affect both the goodwill around farmers in a community, and then also how farm to school policies in a state may influence that. And so we kind of put lots of layers into this model. And next slide, what we kind of found as highlights are that farm to school activity, and this is at the county level again, has a very positive influence on operating margins of farms. And it's not just the farms who are actually selling to school. It appears to have some kind of a public relations or goodwill effect that for all farms in that area, it seems to be helping them perform better. But there's other things that matter too, like having an active farmers market or food hub in the area also really helps improving profits, particularly for those low performing farms that are in that red zone we looked at before. And the role of farm to school in helping farmers really does seem dependent on the scale. And so some of those larger farms by sales are already doing quite well, but some of those lower volume, smaller size farms are benefiting the most from this activity. So that's something, again, policymakers want to know is actually true. Farmers are potentially winning from this. Next slide. This just shows you the same thing graphically, that it also depends on where farmers are selling the product. So where we're seeing farmers benefit the most is from that gray line. You'll see on the left-hand side, those who are in direct markets are benefiting the most when there's farm to school. But that's really complementary and logical if you think about the people who would benefit the most are the parents who see their kid excited about the sweet corn they had at school, or the local hamburger they had at school, and want to take their parents to the market to see if they can see the farmer they learned about or heard about or visited the farm of at the market, where the family can see what got their child so excited. Next slide. Sorry, I'm hitting on so many things. Another project that we looked at was looking at food hubs, and without having to get into the weeds again a little bit, one really interesting thing we found is that these food hubs, these organizations that are forming that have those more equitable business practices Nicole was talking about, we want to know why they are and are not performing and surviving throughout the country. So this is a national study again, but you can see what we kind of try to measure is how many thousand people do we need to support a food hub. So just like you think about when a Starbucks opens, how many people need to be in that neighborhood before Starbucks has enough business to stay open? We kind of did the same thing with food hubs. And so a bar moving to the left means an area needed less people to be able to survive if it also had another characteristic. And not surprisingly, one of those characteristics is they have other innovative businesses like mobile food businesses. They have a community food service activity there. That could be anything from a food pantry to something else that is found an innovative way to get food from farms to consumers. But the thing we found really interesting is that fourth bar there, higher social capital. The more social capital and cohesion you have in a community, the more likely it is a food hub can survive and not need a huge population to do so. And that's really, really pertinent for our rural areas, because sometimes why businesses don't survive is there's just not quite enough business for them to do to be viable. This was our first evidence that some things like that social cohesion really do matter for the viability of businesses. Next slide. So the takeaways, you know, just like Nicole said, we're really excited about all the interdisciplinary work that's going on, where we're trying to find linkages between local and regional food systems, which are commonly hand in hand with regenerative. I just said degenerative. I'm so sorry. I'm going too fast. There's things that do go hand with regenerative agriculture, and we're the reason I wanted to hit so many is that literally whatever area you're interested in, I probably could find you a great study now. And compared to 20 years ago when I started in this field and I had to dig hard to find any study, I'm just so excited to see the level of intellectual and community-based activity that's going on to do some really authentic discovery and technical assistance and applied research to inform the policies and market programs that are going on in the space. So thank you for letting me go through a lot quickly. Happy to answer questions in the chat box, but I'm going to turn it over to Wendy so she gets a bit of time herself.
Thank you so much, Dawn. That was wonderful. And I think there are actually quite a few questions coming in for you in the chat. So if you're willing to answer those, that would be perfect.
I'll start typing.
Thanks. And then we have Wendy, who is calling in by phone because she's actually out of power right now. So we are going to do the slides, and hopefully it works. I think Nicole will maybe help. She's seen the slides before, so we'll maybe be able to help with that. So let's give it a go.
And I doubt she has, but that's okay. They're very, very simple. So hi, everybody. Thank you. This is Wendy. Yeah, I am immunocompromised and have 3 kids, but have the real deep fortune of being able to isolate with my parents for half the summer, but they live way up in the mountains in western Montana. So the power is out again. So I'm sorry that I can't sort of be with you there in person and see your faces and see your questions. As we move along, if there are any questions for me, please, if you wouldn't mind just reading them out to me when we get there, that would be great. So this is, I am Wendy. I am Director of Strategic Initiatives at Live Well, Colorado. I am not actually going to be talking about any of the work that we do directly as an organization. Also, just a note as well that we are in a point of pretty big transition with our organization, and that if there's anything that we do or you know about that we do and you want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about anyone. We are in about to finish a 100% rebrand that will probably launch August 1st. So we have a new name, logo, mission, vision, just approved final website copy today. So we are actually going to be Nourish Colorado, transforming food systems is our tagline. So Live Well Colorado, as you know it, is in terms of brand and mission vision is going to be retired. So more coming on that. But just real briefly, there's no slide for this, but our role at Live Well is it's sort of been alluded to throughout this as well, as we do a lot of work on local procurement. We do a lot of work around the state around healthy food incentives for programs like Double Up Food Bucks and a CSA program that we work in partnership with the WIC and Older Adult Congregate Meal Program. We do pretty extensive work at the state and federal level around policy advocacy work that really sort of in conjunction with our healthy food incentives and healthy local procurement work. But what I want to end with here today with really simple, just sort of bullet point slides. But hopefully that was a lot. I know I'm still absorbing a lot from what I just heard from Nicole and Dawn. So I'm going to give us all a little bit of a brain break now, and just want to talk about a COVID responsive initiative that we have been a part of. So this first slide here is about the Colorado Farm and Food Systems Response Team. Throughout this, I just hyperlinked a few things, assuming the slides will go out. So assuming if you want more information, you can click on hyperlinks and go for more information. So the Colorado Farm and Food Systems Response Team, that is a link to an overview about the team, is about is made up of about 14 or so different organizations. We are just one of them that came together really through a very rapid networking process in late March. And just to give you a sense of like who is involved, it is us, it is CSU, it is Rocky Mountain Local Foods, it is Frontline Farming, it is Mile High Farmers, it's National Young Farmers Coalition, it's Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, it is the Department of Agriculture, it is the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council, and probably a few others that I'm forgetting to mention right now. And so through a rapid networking process in late March, several of us came together to really kind of understand in this sort of mid and pre-COVID world, what might this mean for our food systems here in Colorado, and sort of what services and resources were being offered up and guided and provided to players within our local and regional food systems. So as you can see here, this team that came together rapidly and informally has sort of been working on its purpose and its area of focus, knowing that there's many, many resources coming to bear across agriculture right now. This team came together, as you can see here, really to support farmers and ranchers responding to changing market opportunities in the midst of COVID. So as an example, we really kind of took our cue from some research that Dawn was involved with, and her colleague Becca Jablonski and many others from CSU that really started to look at immediately in late March, like in this world of COVID, what may this mean for certain type of producers that may be losing market access more immediately and more rapidly and more long-term ways than others, and who was addressing those needs in sort of the midst of loss of market access. We also came together to make sure that all Colorado producers are equitably connected to resources and markets, and we'll talk about that. And we came together to account for the specific needs of small and mid-sized growers, direct market farms, beginning farmers and ranchers, veteran farmers, Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color, and female farmers. And there's a lot we could talk about and unpack right there. But, and this is something I'll come up a few places in my slides here, is that, you know, in coming together and looking at some of the research that came out of CSU and elsewhere about looking at the types of our partners, our farm and ranch partners that may be affected by loss of very specific markets because they were selling to schools, they were selling to restaurants, they were selling to local supply chains that experienced some immediate and maybe longer term disruptions. We also came together to try to pretty quickly understand, and we're still in the midst of trying to learn and understand how growers that have very historically been marginalized and underserved, often very intentionally by programs from the USDA and others, and to try to understand in this world of COVID, as the USDA and others respond with direct relief and to shore up markets, who might still be being left out of those resources and that kind of assistance. And so some of it, and the issue we've been struggling with this whole time, is how do we know kind of the gap to shoot, right? In a world of imperfect data, how do we know, how do we listen? How do we look to anecdotal evidence? How do we look to qualitative information? How do we look to quantitative information? And how do we listen and learn from our own process to really continue to try to understand who is not receiving that relief, who is not receiving that assistance, who is still experiencing disruption. And so a lot of these things came together to sort of hone our focus on the kind of populations and identities that you see listed here, trying to understand those that may not have a relationship, say, with FSA, Farm Services Agency, or other USDA programming, and how can we make sure that we are more equitably connecting our farm and ranch partners to resources. So next slide. So just really quickly around the Farm and Food Systems Response Team, just so you know sort of how a few things that we're up to. The Farm and Food System Respond and Rebuild Fund, which is what I'm going to spend the rest of my slides talking about. There's a link there to our fund. So we did start a small grant program. We do weekly statewide calls that are every Thursdays from 11 to noon. I think tomorrow, is our 12th straight statewide call. We've typically been having sort of 100 or plus attendance, which is pretty incredible. Obviously, we've seen a bit of a dip when growers are obviously a little more occupied at 11 a.m. on a Thursday than to be on a call. But anyone is welcome to join those tomorrow. This is a very poor description of the call tomorrow. But tomorrow's call, for example, let me know if you want to join at 11 a.m., is really going to be focused on PPE needs and projected trends for farmers and agricultural workers. And how different sectors in the economy and agencies are preparing themselves with supplies to respond. And also sharing some information around the Colorado COVID-19 agricultural industry guidance from the state and other federal and Colorado laws that provide protections for farm workers and what is not covered. So that is the call tomorrow at 11. We also have other tools like a Slack channel for the Food and Farm Forum, and we do send out weekly policy digests that compilate state and federal policy that is relevant to our focus. So next slide. So I'm going to spend the rest of a few slides talking about the actual fund. So the Farm and Food System Respond and Rebuild Fund. It is a small grant fund. So first, in terms of eligibility, there are basically two tracks within the fund. There's a producer track and an intermediary track. So the first track is you're eligible if you are a small, mid-sized direct market producer with sales between $1,000 and $1 million. And the other track is the intermediary track. So food hubs, farmers markets associations, other intermediaries that are really working with local regional producers to access other markets. So next slide, please. So just a little bit about where we're at with the Respond and Rebuild Fund. Round one closed back in May. In round one of the small grant fund, we issued $140,000 to 27 different producers and 2 intermediaries. We had over 200 applicants for that first round. Round two just recently closed last Thursday. We have set aside around $200,000 to allocate in this round. They are currently under review. We had 39 intermediary applicants and 110 applications from producers directly. Those are both capped. So producer applications, for example, are capped at $5,000 and intermediary applications are capped at $15,000 for this round. We have remaining $190,000 to allocate, and I will get into more about that for our third phase, TBD. So just really quickly, next slide. Types of support through the fund can be PPE, equipment leases. I'm sure you can read through the bullet points here. The costs of pivoting, really, and the shifts to different kinds of sales platforms. There can be labor to support paid time off or testing paid time off for employees for a variety of COVID-related reasons, and replacing farm labor losses are all eligible. Sanitizing, safety measures, procedures, of course, are all eligible. Professional services to support and assess business impact to shifting and making that pivot is eligible, and then other additional operating funds that are COVID responsive. So next slide. Just a couple of quick themes from what we learned from round one. Obviously, we're in the middle of doing the analysis on round two applications, so we don't really have a whole lot to share yet. But from round one, what we heard, a few things of what we heard in terms of sort of immediate needs and requests were obviously those higher costs in pivoting your model, right? It's labor, it's time, it's consultants, it's actual platforms and software, and a lot of costs associated with pivoting your model. Increased risk because there's clearly uncertainty about your market future, understanding new rules and regulations in a COVID world, clear concern that customers are not going to come to your farm, go to your farmer's market, go to the restaurant where you sell, etc. And then projected loss of revenue from agritourism and other in-person experiences. And then we heard a lot around the direct-to-consumer, real need for shifting to online platforms, but a lot of questions and concerns about how best to do that. Great increases in CSA interest and growth, and other sort of pick-up, drop-off models that are a little bit unique to growers or haven't been happening before. So next slide, please. I just wanted to flag this a little bit because it's hot off the presses, and I found a lot of this very important and interesting. So this is round two. So this is the round that we're in the middle of sort of analyzing, and grantees have not been notified. We haven't even been selected yet. So in round two, we learned a lot from our mistakes of round one. It's been really important to us from the beginning, as I said, to say we have imperfect information, but we really want to understand if we're shooting this gap, right? We really want to understand who we are serving, if they are underserved through other means, and how these benefits are really playing out. So we didn't do such a great job of capturing identity characteristics in round 1 and paid much greater attention to that in round 2. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of what we know on the producer side. We're still, by we, I mean our data analyst, Casey, who's amazing, is still analyzing the data. But just a few little examples of what we're learning from the producer applicants, so that's 110 applications, is that you can see the mix there on top between sort of primarily, almost exclusively, I think, veggie crop, diversified crop livestock, and then livestock producers on top. And the vast majority of them were for-profit. There were a few that were nonprofit. In terms of requesting what they're requesting support for, the slight majority of them, as you can see, requested support for both recovering current losses or projected losses and costs, and then all the remainder were requesting support for the cost of pivoting their business model. I was happy to see, I don't know if I should convey emotion, but interested, happy, pleased to see that a very slight majority of all producer applications reported being woman-owned, and obviously that could be a co-ownership, but we're listed as owners of their farm. And then we tried to get to the bottom here around leadership. So one thing that I didn't include here, but is the vast majority, I think 86% of producers were not owner-operated, which is not surprising to me, but we're trying to sort of thread this little needle here of understanding identity characteristics of leadership and management and operation, and how that often very differs from identities of ownership. And if you look at like the ag census data, the vast majority of farms are owned by white males. That is still true, and I'm assuming even in the past, even in 2020, moving into 2021, that is still remaining to be true. Even when you look at sort of intermediary ownership, but when you look at sort of management and leadership, that those identity characteristics shift a lot, and that's really kind of where we wanted to understand who we are working with and supporting and partnering with. So you can just see here, and I apologize, the second line down got bumped over left, I apologize, but so we looked across BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, in terms of represented in leadership, immigrant populations represented in leadership, beginning farmer or ranchers, LGBTQ+, veteran farmers or ranchers, those reporting a physical disability, and then none of the above. So I know it's small and hard to see, but you can kind of see how this is playing out a little bit. We are doing a very good job of reaching beginning farmers and ranchers. The rest of this data, again, we will continue to work and understand how really representative is this of our farming and ranching community, as well as looking about this geographically. So last slide, please. I know we're already at 8:03. So moving forward, just concerning the fund only, is that, obviously we're continuing the Rapid Response Small Grant Fund. And I should have said very early on, I apologize, this fund is mostly managed through one of our primary partners at the National Western Center is managing the Respond and Rebuild Fund, and has a project manager housed at the National Western Center that's been doing most of this work to manage the fund. And so we will continue to finish the review process for the short-term rapid response funding, which is round 2. So grantees should be notified next week. And then we want to move into this rebuild phase, which we're going to give ourselves a bit of a pause and a breath. As I mentioned, we only have $190,000 left allocated. We want to move into some additional partnership building and fundraising for that, and work deeply with obviously our whole farm and food system response team, but also all of you, many, many other partners, to really kind of co-design and develop what, if we could move into a phase 3, the rebuild phase of the fund, how do we use the resources that we have to actually help invest in and support more resilient local and regional food systems infrastructure? So much more to be coming on the rebuild phase. And as always, we're looking for new partners. We are, growing our network here, as it says, is making introductions to others who can benefit from and or contribute to these efforts, and also just supporting the fund. There is a donate here page. There's a donate here link on cofoodsystems.org. It's cofoodsystems.org, and then there's a button that leads you right into the fund, and there's a way to donate. But as we said here too, we're just looking at sort of network development too, and increasing who is involved with the fund and the project. So I am done. I know we're getting close on time. Thank you for all your time. I wish I could see your faces, but thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for that, Wendy. Really appreciate it. And thank you for taking your time, especially in the middle of a power outage. I want to spend the next 10 minutes just going through some of the questions in the chat that weren't answered already. If you have an additional question and we don't get time for it, I'll put my email in the chat and you can email me and I can get it wherever it needs to go. So the first question that we had coming in was from Dina. And Dina says, in order to transition to RFS, we need to give up efficiency as it has been achieved through industrial ag. How can we define a new feasible efficiency under RFS? I assume RFS is more labor intensive, no monocropping, smaller equipment. We are scaling down to some human scale. Does RFS attempt to establish optimal sizes?
I'll take that. And I think I always really question the notion, the inbuilt assumption that our conventional current industrial food system and production models are actually efficient. We waste so much food, and they're really only efficient if you measure them in terms of calories produced, but not necessarily in terms of nutrition produced or nourishment considered more broadly. So I kind of think that, like, unfortunately, a lot of the ways in which we have determined that our food systems are super productive and super successful are based on a lot of fuzzy math, to use a term from a long time ago now, and based on kind of the wrong assumptions for how we evaluate food. So I think that, I guess I push back against the notion of the fact that we actually have an efficient food system, and I think we saw a lot of that in the early weeks of COVID-related closures and distancing and all the dumping that was going on, and also the inefficiencies, frankly, of using lots of fossil fuel intensive production methods to produce animal feed and then converting that feed to animal source calories at really inefficient calorie conversion ratios. So to answer the question more succinctly, I guess I would say that resilient, regenerative food systems would think differently about the purposes of producing food and would ask different questions, measuring efficiency in different ways.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Matthew, and the question is, how does farm to school operate when schools are not in session during the majority of the growing season?
Wendy, you want to take that? You're
sure.
Far more often the farm.
Yeah. Sure, and Don, jump in anytime as well. So it's a great question. And we also get a lot the question of, like, how do you farm to school in Colorado, you know, just with a short growing season and all that. So our growing season is actually pretty long. A couple things is actually schools go back into session, obviously mid-August. So it's actually, you know, a peak harvest. It's actually a really great time for schools to be coming back with such diversity of crops coming on the markets. The other things that we're seeing is that we also track and work with a lot of schools across the state. Obviously, they're doing school gardens, and school gardens are just, if I could just like control everything, I would just say every school should have a garden. It's such a beautiful entry point for kids. But a lot of schools, very diverse experiences, but they do have school gardens. They're able to, you know, build curriculum around them and program those throughout the summer. So you have that sort of that continuation, and then late spring and early fall, integrate some of those garden foods as well. And so what we've seen schools be able to do is actually have pretty extensive seasons, mid-August through the end of October, and pick up again pretty in May in terms of like just straight local procurement. We're seeing an extension too of other products like potatoes, hothouse items that are actually extending throughout the year. And our approach has really been, you know, pick a product, pick a farmer, start a relationship, start the education, start the conversation, and a lot more is going to come from that. But those are really great entry points for education and awareness. And then Dawn can talk a lot more about sort of the economic pathways that open up.
So Dawn's not on the line anymore because she had to go at 8. But one thing that one thing that I have also been involved in here is really thinking a lot about how our infrastructure in the state can take us even further with farm to school. So for example, out on the Western Slope, produce a lot of fruit, right? And it's all really perishable. But there have been studies about what it would take to invest in an IQF, individual quick freeze, or individually quick frozen facility to do really high quality frozen food. And if we can start to do that in the state, then we can potentially get more of that preserved for farm to school throughout longer periods of the school year.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So I actually think that those are all the questions that weren't already answered. So at this point, if anyone wants to chime in with any questions that they have that they weren't able to get into the chat, or if not, we can go through a couple questions in the chat. All right, I'll bring up a question that I thought that was really interesting, and it was talked about in the chat, but I also think people might think it's relevant. And that is, would GMO and genetically engineered foods be considered appropriate for regenerative ag and resilient food systems in general?
Yeah, so this is
whoa. I love that quote. With 5 minutes to go. Take it, Nicole. That's incredible.
No, so that's a really interesting question, right? And this goes back to kind of what I was touching on about how, unlike organic, where we have a national regulatory program that sets out very specific standards and really sets out what you can't do, we don't yet have that for regenerative agriculture. And like I said, there's a debate around whether we want to get to that point. There are some systems of certification and certainly communities of practice that have their own concepts and their own guides, and these varying definitions. So one such system is the regenerative organic certification that has been organized by Rodale and Patagonia, Dr. Bronner's and others, and that considers creating a third-party certification for regeneratively produced food that builds on organic. So it's kind of considered an organic plus system. In such a system, because you can't have genetically modified foods in a certified organic product, you wouldn't be able to use GMOs. But if we separate it from the notion of a market-facing certification, and we think about whether there is any compatibility between bioengineered foods, biotechnology in agriculture, genetically modified foods, and regenerative agriculture paradigms, it forces us to ask what we're trying to do with regenerative agriculture. And so if regenerative agriculture is really about, cover cropping, keeping the soil covered, if it's about building soil, if it's about, well, could they be a part of a rotation, right? About integrating animals on land? It is not completely incompatible with some of the soil building practices that you would see or some of the ways in which we would try to quantify and measure regeneration. However, it really depends on what the modification is. So if we're modifying seeds such that it can be grown in large-scale monoculture and just like be doused with glyphosate and kill all the other species around it, we're really not well aligned with a regenerative paradigm, right? We're not really in a regenerative philosophy. We're still in a very extractive philosophy. But so when we think about the GMOs that are in large-scale use today, they're designed for extractive industrial monoculture. It doesn't mean those are the only potential uses of biotechnology in agriculture, and that there couldn't be future modifications, for example, for disease resistance, that we might eventually see. Like I've heard folks who do some of the cutting edge kind of CRISPR development talking about wanting to develop apples that are resistant to particular types of blight and pests that have their own internal resistance to these things that are otherwise wiping out orchards, which would then prevent the need for these like broad spectrum antibiotic sprays. Those could be potentially more aligned with a regenerative agroforestry orchard system and silvopasture system than dousing it with a whole bunch of antibiotics and creating resistance. So it's really about what the modification is. But when we think of what we're largely growing as genetically modified crops, particularly in the United States today, they don't fit in particularly well.
Thank you. That was a great answer. So for the sake of time, we are at time now. And so, to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm going to say that we're done. But I know that this was a very information-dense webinar, so I want to let everyone know that this will be available on the Facebook page, and it'll also be available on the website. And then I am going to put my email address in the chat right now. So if you had questions that you didn't get answered, feel free to reach out to me. And then Dawn also put her email, and so did Nicole. Wendy, are you comfortable with having your email put in the chat?
Absolutely.
Not to put you on the spot. Okay, perfect.
No,
so I'll go ahead and
drop
drop her email in there as well. So feel free to reach out with questions, and I'm probably gonna have to watch the webinar again too, because this was a lot of information. So thank you so much to our speakers for taking your time today. It was wonderful to have you. And then I also want to say thank you to Pam Sherman, who organized this but was unable to be here because of a power outage. So thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank
Good night.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Be well.
Thank you very much.